I've been to a number of award shows in my life, even nominated for a few. Never won, though. Always a bridesmaid, never a bride. But an interesting thing comes up at these awards, and that is the gender-specific categories. Today on the podcast, we get into what actor Bella Ramsey thinks of them. I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. And one of the most well-known non-binary actors is making the case for gendered categories at the award shows. Bella Ramsey, who stars in The Last of Us, spoke out in a podcast last week, or this week actually, saying that women need to have their own category separate from men. Bella also said that they didn't know what to do with actors who don't fit into either category. Mel Woods has been thinking about this for a long time. Mel, welcome back to Commotion.
Thanks so much.
Okay, before we get into this, why don't we take a listen to the aforementioned Bella, in their own words, speaking on the Louis Theroux podcast this week.
I think it's so important that that's preserved as well. Like the recognition for women in the industry is preserved. Like I think the gendered categories conversation is a really interesting one, and I don't have the answer. And I wish that there was something that was like an easy way around it. But I think that it is really important that we have like a female category and a male category. But then like where do non-binary or gender non-conforming people like fit into that? I don't know. I've literally sat and tried to think my way to the answer and haven't got there.
Mel, unpack that for me. What do you make of what Bella Ramsey's saying there? There's still a need for gender-specific categories for women, Bella says.
Yeah, as a non-binary person working in the culture space, I also have spent long times thinking of an answer, much like Bella has. And they make a good point that, sexism's gonna sexism. And there's a reason that we have these sorts of, I don't want to use the word protected because I think it's quite charged, but isolated spaces in order to recognize women and ensure that the general sexism of these institutions, like the Oscars, like the Emmys, et cetera, doesn't mean that women aren't still getting recognized within those systems. So I totally do see where they are coming from on that. I don't necessarily agree fully with them, but I think that there is a need for, systems within our systems to ensure equity and to ensure inclusion and to ensure diversity. And that applies to women as compared to men, but that does also still apply to trans and non-binary people too. Right. And I think that's the thorny issue that they're trying to get at there.
Sure. I mean, that is the obvious follow-up here. Where does that leave non-binary actors?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of different approaches to that. I think kind of like Bella Ramsey says, kind of like you kind of put your hands up and you say, well, this seems like the best solution, I guess. And it kind of feels yucky sometimes. I know that they've expressed various concerns with kind of not being pleased, being lumped into the idea of being an actress because they aren't. I think that some of us, I'm not an actor, but non-binary people in general, recognize that the systems around us are imperfect. When I apply for my passport, I'm not going to have a gender marker that perfectly reflects my lived experience of gender, the same way that an actor who submits themselves for an award, we have to categorize things. Categories exist. There's always going to be lines drawn around the boxes of being. And people are going to feel left out on the sidelines of that regardless. And it sucks. It's not a good thing, but it's part of how these systems have been built.
Okay, so related to what you're saying, there were people who were upset when Bella was nominated for an Emmy in the Best Actress category 2 years ago. What was Bella's own take on that?
Yeah, they said at the time that, they feel not quite right about being called an actress, but they also don't take it too seriously, right? And that it's not necessarily a big attack on their identity. It's just a funny thing that doesn't really fit. And I think that, cis folks or folks who don't really regularly interact with non-binary folks or trans folks maybe have this perception that we're all very militant about our identities, that we're like, if you get my pronoun wrong, I'm going to burn down a house. And it's the fact of the matter is most trans and non-binary people are very chill and accept, again, that there are imperfect systems around us. And what we are calling for is is to be kind of recognized and to have autonomy within those systems. And I think we've seen different trans and non-binary actors approach this in different ways than Bella has. Some have really said, I'm not going to submit myself for awards because they don't reflect me. And that's, Liv Hewson from Yellow Jackets said that a couple of years ago. But whereas you compare to like Emma D'Arcy, who has said repeatedly that they are tired of being asked about this because it's kind of an annoying topic to keep getting asked about when you want to be talking about your work, when you want to be talking about your show, when your identity is not the most interesting thing about you. And I think we've seen a lot of actors kind of move towards this idea of just kind of choosing the one that fits best. And we saw that most recently, at the Tony Awards. The nominations just came out last week. Cola Scola nominated for Best Actor in a Play. Non-binary, uses they, them pronouns, but they are submitted in the actor category. And they've said, they chose that one because it fits best. And sometimes we have to work within the imperfect systems, but I obviously dream of a utopian day when our systems are no longer imperfect.
Right. Okay. So speaking of utopia, this is not it, but you mentioned the Tonys, and with the Tonys, you're sort of edging into what I think is a very interesting part of this discussion, which is the music industry. That's a whole different story. The Juno Awards have been gender neutral since 2003, the Grammys since 2012. The Brit Awards dropped gender-specific categories 3 years ago. So I'm wondering, are we seeing fewer women, trans, non-binary people getting recognized when the awards do go gender neutral, right? In other words, the real question is the music industry a cautionary tale, or is it offering up a good solution?
Well, it's complicated. The one thing that the music industry does is genre-specific awards. You look at the Grammys, there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of awards. And some of those categories are overrepresented by men, and some of those categories are overrepresented by women. Look at the best pop vocal performance category and tell me that men are going to be overrepresented in that category and that they're going to try and put like Benson Boone against Ariana Grande. Like, that's not going to happen. And so I think that you can always find examples that kind of skew one way or another within that. At the same time, those genre categories are imperfect. We see this with the kind of inability to recognize Black people outside of R&B categories and things at the Grammys that have become a problem historically for many years. So genres are imperfect in that way, but I think they are a good model for making sure that people are not forced into that kind of box of choosing that Bella is talking about.
Right on. In that interview with Louis Theroux, Bella Ramsey said there was no obvious option for actors who don't fit into the gender binary. What are some of the ideas out there?
Again, there's that idea of a category for everybody, make it a big omnibus category. There's breaking up by genre. You look at the Oscars. I think there's a case to be made that the same way we talk about the Golden Globes of having drama and comedy, could the Oscars be doing that and getting more people recognized, giving out more awards? Always a nice thing to give out more awards. And then, there is this often a conversation saying like, well, let's make a special category for the gender neutral case. And it's like, well, I don't think any non-binary people really want to be isolated off into our own special zone where we're not allowed to be with everybody else. But there are some people who may call for that.
So as you say all this, it remains as complex as it seems, but I want to put you on the spot, Mel, before we go here. You're in charge of award shows, let's say. What, in your humble opinion, is the best scenario that would allow non-binary people to get the recognition they deserve without, compromising the way that they show up in the world?
Yeah, I mean, optimistically, I would love to degender award categories, but I think that requires a level of change at the top of these institutions. And again, there are, to go back to the beginning of this conversation, sexism is going to sexism, and things like the Emmys, like the Oscars, there's sexism baked into that. And we see the Oscars in particular trying to take these steps to diversify its voting base, by expanding much more internationally, by forcing people to actually watch the movies. And I think that more steps like that will make a fully degendered award category actually be equitable and inclusive and whatnot. So we can't just degender it and be like, here's a list of 10 people, because I think that the forces at play of exclusion, and again, that's not just on gender, that's on race, that's on a lot of other factors, are going to happen. So I think we need to be changing these systems at the top if we're going to move that in that direction. And I would love to see that one day. But in the meantime, I think what we are seeing right now, where actors are given the kind of autonomy to choose how they fit into it and how they're leading these conversations, I think is the most important. We have to listen to the people who are actually involved with this and let them lead the way on what the best solution is.
All right, Mel, thanks for your insight. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks for speaking to me about this.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mel Woods is a senior editor at Extra Magazine in Vancouver. We were talking about Bella Ramsey, who stars in The Last of Us, which you can watch the new season of right now on Crave. I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. And this weekend, a Canadian wrestling brand with a storied history is making its return to an iconic Toronto spot with its own place in Canadian wrestling lore. Maple Leaf Wrestling was a major player in Canada's pro wrestling industry for more than half a century. It folded in the 1980s. Recently, the brand was bought, renamed Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling. This Saturday, it'll be making a return to its Toronto home base, what was once known as the iconic Maple Leaf Gardens, now called Mattamy Athletic Center. Sarah Kurchak is a huge wrestling fan with me right now. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
So what was your reaction to this news that Maple Leaf Wrestling was back, rebranded Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling after a many-decade hiatus, I guess we would call it?
Yeah, hiatus. Back from the dead, I guess. I was super intrigued. I didn't start watching wrestling until adulthood, actually. I'm a rare case.
Oh.
But this is a name that would come up when I was learning about Canadian wrestling history. It was also spoken about quite reverently by my fellow local fans. So it has taken on mythical proportions, like, in everybody's mind in and around this area. So it's very exciting to see it come back. And I'm really excited to see what it will do next as well.
You mentioned the mythical proportions. Let's talk about that a bit. People who might be unfamiliar with the history of Maple Leaf brand, this Maple Leaf brand of wrestling, what should they know?
Well, if you have ever heard anyone talk about wrestling at the Gardens, whether they watched it at the Gardens or on CHCH TV, this is the brand they were talking about. It was formed in 1930 by a boxing promoter who was looking to expand. They started working out of Maple Leaf Gardens as their home base the following year when it opened. It was a very reliable way to get people in the door and spending money when hockey wasn't in town. And they continued to just excel in this area for over 50 years, bringing in international talent like Ric Flair, also building Canadian talent that went on to international fame, like Tiger Jeet Singh or Killer Kowalski. Maple Leaf Wrestling played a fundamental role in making them who they were. And they ran this way right up until sort of the WWF started taking over territories in the 80s. And if you read between the lines, I think sort of begrudgingly had to give up and sell to the WWF in 1984.
As you talk about WWF, it's important, to recognize every time we talk about a wrestling league, we're always three conversation pieces away from talking about the owner of the league. The owners always loom big in the background, sometimes in the foreground. So the owner of Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling now is Scott D'Amore. So tell me his backstory.
So D'Amore has done pretty much everything you can do in wrestling. Starting as a fan, he actually grew up watching Maple Leaf Wrestling. He went on to become a wrestler who wrestled around the world as an on-air talent, which is how I started becoming familiar with him. He was the mouthpiece of the sort of Bret Hart-esque villain everywhere else, hero in Canada, Team Canada in Total Nonstop Action in the 2000s, and was great in that capacity. He also worked backstage for them and eventually became their president when it became Impact. Most recently, he was fired in 2024. WWE might be looming over that as well, but we won't get into that. He is someone who has always struck me as having an eye for unique talent and some good ideas for how to spotlight that talent. So I think he's a really good person to be at the helm of this particular project.
Okay. Getting into this project and the present, who are some of the names in the new Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling stable that have you excited right now?
Well, Giselle Shaw, who is like a Canadian legend in the making. We're looking at Brent Banks is going to have an appearance. Mike Bailey, Stu Grayson are, international stars now who made good in Canada. And I'm also really excited about my local favorite, the body slam aficionado, Psycho Mike.
Psycho Mike. All right. We talked about the state of wrestling in the U.S. on this show a few months ago. A big part of that conversation revolved around gender and racial diversity. Wrestling has been a big deal for Canadians of different racial backgrounds. And that's been for decades, So how is Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling looking on that front?
I'll admit there's still a number of white guys on the card that is probably not perfectly in line with Canada and especially Toronto's demo. But there are some really meaningful steps they're taking here. There are a number of Black wrestlers on the card. There's a lot of Asian representation, including South Asian representation. There's also some meaningful steps in gender diversity as well. There's 2 women's matches on the card, which I know that's a low bar, but anytime you have more than the token 1, it is very promising right now. There's also an openly trans wrestler on the card and an openly non-binary wrestler on the card. And there's also a number of different wrestling styles and personalities and places where they are in the story, which might sound weird to the uninitiated that I'm bringing that up in terms of a conversation about diversity. But there are a number of promotions, WWE being one of them, that tend to put wrestlers of a race, ethnicity, or even nationality into units or only portray them in one light. So, the Black wrestlers go in this box, or the French Canadian wrestlers go into this box. And I don't see any of that stereotyping or pigeonholing happening in Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling. And I think that's really promising as well.
I think the big question, for wrestling fans and even some non-wrestling fans will be, how will this league compete, right? Canadian wrestling is going to be up against things like WWE, which now has Netflix behind it as well. So how's that going to look in your mind?
I think they're really smart to focus on just sort of building locally in Toronto, in Windsor. I think they're going into Quebec next. And using a great mix of, say, bringing in international talent that is already established to bring people into the building or onto the pay-per-view. And then once they're there, letting the local talent shine so that they can start to build them up as actual stars themselves.
Right on. So, I'm going to reiterate this in case people aren't clear on that. The big event Saturday is happening at what's called the Mattamy Athletic Center. So this is the old Maple Leaf Gardens. So the old Maple Leaf Wrestling is happening at the old Maple Leaf Gardens. It's this whole, really like a sort of a nostalgic thing for a lot of people. This is where the center of it, right? The Forum in Montreal was the same thing where I grew up. This is Maple Leaf Gardens was the big deal here. What can you tell us about Saturday's lineup that you haven't told us so far?
So it's going to be about a bit of a homecoming, but you know what? Maple Leaf Gardens and Mattamy aren't exactly the same. Maple Leaf Wrestling and Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling aren't exactly the same. So it's also going to be, I think, the launching pad for what Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling will be. So that includes having a 20-man gauntlet to establish the Maple Leaf Pro Canadian champion. We will also be crowning our first ever Maple Leaf Pro Canadian Women's Champion in a match with Kylie Ray versus the aforementioned Giselle Shaw. And then in the main event, we are going to have, in very, very old school classic Maple Leaf Wrestling style, our proud local hero, Stu Grayson, facing off against the NWA World Champion.
Okay, very nice. Anybody you're rooting for in particular?
Oh, I am always excited to see Mike Bailey. I've watched them grind it out on the indies for years. They're now in AEW made good, and this will be a triumphant return to the area for them.
Very nice. I messaged my friend Andrew Fung, who people will be familiar with if they're CBC fans, and I said, hey, what do you know about Maple Leaf Pro? And he said, you want to go? And I said, okay, so I'm going to be there too. And I'll ask you not to give me an elbow drop or anything like that. Thank you very much.
I'll be gentle. Yep.
Okay. Last question to you. This is all happening as trade tensions between Canada and the U.S. have sparked a renewed appetite for Canadiana. Now, how do you see that Maple Leaf Wrestling rebrand fitting into that broader conversation?
I think the timing is ripe for this kind of promotion. It's not jingoistic, but it is proud. It does a good job of celebrating international talent while also highlighting what we have here. If it goes well, I think it could be a prototype for many creative industries in this country.
And I think the term elbows up couldn't find a more comfortable home than in the wrestling ring as well. Those elbows are up quite a bit. All right, we have to leave it there, Sarah. Thank you for chatting with me about all this.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Sarah Kurchak is a culture critic and the author of I Overcame My Autism and All I Got Was This Lousy Anxiety Disorder. Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling returns to the former Maple Leaf Gardens. It's now called Mattamy Athletic Center. This is how bad an athlete I've become that the word athletic doesn't even roll off the tongue. It's happening this Saturday in Toronto. And that's it for that chat. And we're also going to say goodbye to the folks watching us on YouTube. Commotion will be back tomorrow. For the rest of you, stick around.